Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a case that's both baffling and heartbreaking, the disappearance of Stephen Clark.
A case that reminds us how quickly the ordinary can turn extraordinary.
Yeah.
How a simple walk on the beach can become the starting point of a decades-long search for answers.
You're right. It's almost like something out of a movie. Picture this. It's 1992. Stephen's a 23-year-old apprentice
Okay.
living with his parents in Marska by the Sea in the UK.
Right.
He's close to his family, especially his sister Victoria. He's got some mobility limitations from a childhood accident, but he's living a pretty typical life for a young man his age.
And that's what makes his disappearance so jarring.
Yeah.
It's the day after Christmas, December 28th.
Oh, wow.
Time for family and relaxation.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen decides to skip a football match with his dad and instead joins his mother Doris for their usual walk along the beach.
A scenic 2-mile stretch from Marska to Saltburn.
Exactly.
You can almost feel that crisp sea air as you imagine them walking along that familiar path.
But then at the Saltburn pier, Stephen tells his mom he needs to use the restroom.
Hmm.
He heads in, she waits outside, and he simply vanishes.
So Doris waited, saw other people coming and going from the restroom,
Right.
and eventually decided to head back home, assuming Stephen might have done the same.
Yeah.
But when she got back, he wasn't there.
Nope.
And it wasn't until Stephen's father returned from the football match that the family truly grasped the gravity of the situation
Right.
and began a frantic search. And this is where things get really puzzling. The police initially told the family they had to wait a full 24 hours before they could even file a missing person report. You might be wondering, what the rationale was behind that policy back then.
It's a stark contrast to how missing person cases are handled today,
Mm-hmm.
highlighting how protocols have evolved over time.
Yeah, for sure.
Sadly, that 24-hour delay, coupled with a lack of detailed records from the initial investigation, really hindered the search efforts right from the start.
The family was essentially left to conduct their own investigation, desperately combing cliffsides, sand dunes, anywhere they thought Stephen might have wandered.
Exactly.
Imagine the frustration and helplessness they must have felt, facing such a lack of support from the very system that's supposed to help in these situations.
Absolutely, and that initial setback cast a long shadow over the entire case.
Yeah, it feels that way for sure.
As weeks turned into months, the family clung to any shred of hope,
Right.
and then two potential sightings offered a glimmer, albeit a fleeting one.
These sightings, even if ultimately mistaken, must have provided a surge of hope for the family.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about them?
One came from a family friend who thought he saw Stephen in red car a few days after the disappearance.
Okay.
Another came from someone who knew Stephen through mutual friends, claiming she saw him walking with an older man in Saltburn weeks later.
Interesting. Couldn't the sightings, even if mistaken, offer clues about people who were in the area at the time? Could there be a connection we're missing?
That's a valid point. Every detail, no matter how seemingly insignificant, could potentially hold a piece of the puzzle. It's like trying to solve a giant jigsaw puzzle with some pieces missing.
Right.
You have to consider every possible angle.
And when you're dealing with a missing person case, every piece of information, every lead is infused with the weight of hope and despair.
Right.
It's a delicate balance. But in Stephen's case, there were other details that added layers of complexity to the investigation. For instance, during Christmas, Stephen had asked his sister about suicide methods. While she dismissed it at the time, it's a detail that takes on new significance after his disappearance.
It certainly adds another layer of complexity. And then there's the fact that Stephen's family had moved around quite a bit, to South Africa, and back then several moves within the UK. These transitions, coupled with the loss of his grandmother, could have contributed to underlying stress and emotional strain that might be relevant to understanding what happened.
So we have these individual pieces of the puzzle. The sightings, the question about suicide, the moves, none of which definitively point to a specific answer. Yet they all contribute to the overall complexity of the case. It's like trying to decipher a code without knowing all the symbols.
And for years, that's all the family had to go on. Fragmented information, dwindling media attention, and no real answers. They even advocated for a missing persons DNA database, hoping that might lead to a break in the case.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they had to learn to live with the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing what happened to Stephen.
But the story doesn't end there. 2 decades later, a twist emerges that throws the entire case into question.
Oh, well.
And that's where we'll pick up next time, exploring the dramatic shift that turns Stephen's loved ones into the prime suspects.
Remember those years of silence and unanswered questions we discussed? Well, in 2020, that silence is shattered.
Yeah.
When police officers show up at Victoria's doorstep with news that changes everything.
Oh my
Her
God.
parents, Doris and Charles, are arrested on suspicion of Stephen's murder.
Wow. Imagine the shock of receiving that news after so many years, after decades of unanswered questions, to suddenly have the finger pointed at your own parents.
Right.
Must have been incredibly difficult to process.
Absolutely.
What triggered this sudden shift in the investigation after all this time?
It turns out the police had been quietly working the case for at least a year before they approached Victoria, and the driving force behind this renewed interest. An anonymous letter sent to the police way back in 1999.
So for 20 years, this letter sat in a file somewhere,
Yeah,
potentially holding crucial information that could have changed the course of the investigation.
right.
What did this mysterious letter say, and why did it take so long for the police to act on it?
This letter, shrouded in mystery, contained information that cast suspicion on Stephen's parents.
Okay.
What's perplexing is that there are conflicting reports about whether Charles was even aware of this letter's existence at the time.
Really?
He claims to have only vaguely remembered hearing about it, but never actually seeing it. While police records suggest they discussed the letter with him back in 1999.
That's strange. Why would they have taken more concrete action back then if they thought the letter might be credible?
Yeah, it's very strange.
Did they explain why they decided to revisit it after all these years?
That's not entirely clear. It's possible that new information or advancements in investigative techniques prompted them to re-examine the case file,
Oh.
leading them back to the letter. But the timing does raise questions about the thoroughness of the original investigation.
It's a haunting thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
What if they had acted on it sooner? But regardless, the emergence of this letter threw a wrench into everything the family thought they knew.
Right.
Now, not only were they grappling with Stephen's disappearance, but they were also faced with the horrifying accusation that their own parents might be involved.
And the way the police handled the investigation from that point on is quite unsettling.
Yeah.
The interrogation of Victoria was particularly intense.
Okay.
They grilled her for hours, focusing on family dynamics, pushing her to reveal any instances of violence or abuse, and even trying to get her to incriminate her parents. It must have been a grueling experience.
That's incredibly aggressive. What was their rationale for this approach? Were they presenting any concrete evidence or a clear motive?
Not really. What's striking is that the focus of the interrogation seems less about uncovering evidence and more about shaping a narrative.
So they essentially had a theory and were trying to force the evidence to fit it. What about Doris and Charles? How did their interrogations go?
Doris and Charles were also subjected to separate interrogations.
Okay.
Doris described a particularly aggressive line of questioning, with the officer accusing her of being controlling, violent, and ultimately a murderer.
Oh my.
The demand, tell us where the body is. It's a classic interrogation tactic. Pressure accusation, and the implication that cooperation is the only way out.
But even after all this intense scrutiny, they're released on bail, leaving them in this unsettling limbo of being suspects while the police continue their search for Stephen's remains.
This must have been an incredibly stressful and confusing time for the entire family.
Absolutely.
What happened next?
The search for Stephen's remains took on an almost frantic energy. They excavated the Clarks' backyard, zeroing in on an area of significance which is never really explained.
Oh, really?
They tore up the garden, moved sheds, but found nothing.
So even with this renewed effort, there was still a lack of physical evidence.
Right.
Is it possible that after so many years, any trace of Stephen would be incredibly difficult to find, even if something had happened to him in that area?
Absolutely. The passage of time can make finding physical evidence incredibly challenging, especially in outdoor environments where weather, erosion, and other factors can play a significant role.
Yeah, it makes sense.
The lack of physical evidence doesn't necessarily mean nothing happened, but it certainly makes the investigation more difficult. And all of this is happening under the harsh glare of the media spotlight. The story of Stephen's disappearance and his parents' arrest became a national sensation. Reporters hounded the family, the public presumed guilt, and Victoria was caught in a terrible bind.
It's a classic trial by media where perception trumps facts, and the presumption of innocence is eroded by speculation and innuendo.
Right.
Victoria's decision to stay out of the limelight, primarily to protect her own children from the media frenzy, was actually twisted into evidence against her parents. That's a cruel irony.
It's a difficult situation all around. How did they cope with this intense public scrutiny while simultaneously dealing with the accusations against their parents? It must have felt like the world was closing in on them.
It was undoubtedly an incredibly stressful and isolating experience.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to grieve the loss of your brother while simultaneously defending your parents against accusations of murder. It's a scenario that most of us can't even fathom.
It's heartbreaking to think about the emotional toll this must have taken on the entire family. And as if the situation wasn't already complex enough, cracks began to appear in the initial narrative the police had constructed. Remember those two key sightings we've discussed earlier?
Yeah.
Well, those started to unravel under closer scrutiny.
You're right. The family friend who thought he saw Stephen in red car admits it was raining heavily, and he couldn't clearly see the person's face. He only assumed it was Stephen based on his walk. And the woman who reported seeing Stephen with the older man was deemed too far away to make a reliable identification, especially given the darkness.
So with those sightings discredited, the police were back to square one with no credible sightings of Stephen after he entered that public restroom. What a frustrating turn of events for the investigators.
Yeah.
But even more shocking was what happened next.
Yes. This is where the case takes a truly unexpected turn. Remember that anonymous letter we talked about, the one that reignited the investigation? Well, the writer of that letter came forward, and her story is quite astonishing.
Okay, this is where my jaw dropped. It turns out the letter was written by a woman who had absolutely no connection to the Clark family.
Wow.
Her hunch that the parents were involved was based purely on a feeling, not any actual evidence or firsthand knowledge.
It's a shocking revelation, isn't it?
Yeah.
To think that an anonymous letter based on nothing more than a gut feeling led to the arrest, interrogation, and public shaming of a grieving family.
Right.
It really makes you question the safeguards in place to prevent situations like this.
It really does. This case is a stark illustration of how easily suspicion can morph into accusation and how fragile the line between justice and prejudice can be. And the fallout for the Clark family was devastating. Doris and Charles were eventually cleared as suspects, but the damage was done. Their reputations were tarnished, their lives upended, and their grief compounded by the trauma of being wrongfully accused. How do you even begin to rebuild your life after something like that?
It's hard to imagine the emotional toll this took on them. They were essentially robbed of their chance to grieve their son's disappearance, properly forced instead to defend themselves against these unfounded accusations.
This whole situation highlights a number of systemic issues, wouldn't you say? From the botched initial investigation to the over-reliance on an anonymous tip to the rush to judgment fueled by media sensationalism?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This case serves as a powerful example of how the justice system can sometimes fail those it's meant to protect.
Yeah.
It underscores the importance of evidence-based investigations, the careful vetting of information, and the presumption of innocence until proven guilty.
Even though the Clarks were cleared, we're still left with the original mystery. What happened to Stephen Clark?
It's a frustrating reality and a reminder that even with advancements in forensic technology and investigative techniques, some cases simply remain unsolved. There are still pieces of the puzzle missing.
And in Stephen's case, those missing pieces could be out there somewhere. The case is still open, and the police are appealing for any information, no matter how insignificant it may seem.
This is where you, our listener, might play a role.
Right.
Sometimes a seemingly small detail, a memory, a connection, can be the key to unlocking a cold case.
Yeah.
Think back to what we've discussed.
Mm-hmm.
The walk along the beach, the public restroom, the pier, the town of Saltburn. Did you or anyone you know happen to be in that area on December 28th, 1992?
Even if it seems irrelevant, it's worth reaching out to the authorities. They're still particularly interested in speaking with Stephen's girlfriend from 1992. She might hold valuable insights into Stephen's state of mind leading up to his disappearance.
Remember, this deep dive is just a starting point. We've laid out the facts, the theories, the dead ends. Now it's up to you to continue the exploration. We encourage you to seek out the ITV documentary and the Missing podcast episode for deeper insights into the case.
And as you delve further, consider this. Could there be other unreported sightings of Stephen, perhaps even witnesses who were hesitant to come forward back then? Could there be someone out there who holds the missing piece of this heartbreaking puzzle?
The vanishing of Stephen Clark is a stark reminder that even in the most ordinary of circumstances, the unexpected can happen, leaving behind a ripple effect of pain, uncertainty, and unanswered questions.
It's true.
It's a case that compels us to look beyond assumptions, to examine the evidence carefully, and to remember that even amidst the fog of time, the search for truth should never be abandoned.